Such a bomb package.
Hey everyone, can you hear us? Hello, hello. All right. All right. Okay, perfect. Cool. So I have some of my favorite speakers with me. I actually sat in on their session during DevCon, and then I dragged them to Coinbase to present, and now I've dragged them here. So out of all the different sessions I've ever sat in, I've sat in on a lot. I've never seen any with so much data, which is why I've been dragging them everywhere, because I feel like they have so much to share. So I want you guys to welcome Everett and Mally. They're from ConsenSys, and they'll be talking about the metrics and methodology for determining the health and viability of a blockchain network, and they'll be focusing on Ethereum. And I'll pass the mic off to them.
Great.
Hey everyone.
Let's get this live first. All right, can everyone
see our slides?
Can everyone see the slides?
I don't see any new yeses, but we can see it on the other computer. Okay.
Hey, so as Sinju said, my name is Everett. I'm a researcher and a product marketer at ConsenSys.
And I'm Mally, and I'm a writer at ConsenSys. Thanks again, Shinju, for asking us to talk to all of you at Trustless. And as she said, we've presented these concepts twice so far at DevCon in Osaka and at Coinbase. And Shinju asked us to angle this presentation today toward the Ethereum network's migration to proof of stake. But mostly we're going to be talking about Ethereum 1.0. So decentralization is an often cited, but we think insufficiently understood concept in the blockchain space. What does it actually mean to measure the decentralization of the network, determine its extent, and how it changes over time? So over the last 6-ish months, we've been trying to figure out ways to do that. And we're going to share our findings and outline what's going to change in Ethereum 2.0 so we can continue monitoring our collective progress on decentralization. So generally, the most popular comparative network metric between protocols is throughput. And at this stage in most sufficiently adopted blockchains, the more decentralized and secure a blockchain is, the lower the throughput. We recognize that what could provide most value to this discussion of blockchain adoption at this phase in the technology's evolution is focusing on decentralization. So as we tried to measure existing protocols' decentralization at a given point in time, we realized that comparing most of these metrics across protocols and across different consensus mechanisms and algorithms is like comparing apples and oranges. The whole ecosystem is quite young, and it takes time to build out these networks and to scale a given protocol. And we're, of course, nowhere near the optimal level of decentralization on practically any metric on any blockchain now in early 2020. So we amended our search, and instead of asking which protocol can prove itself now to be the most decentralized, we wanted to ask, what does the evolution of decentralization look like across different protocols over time? Can those trends indicate which one will be the most decentralized in the future? So we started that analysis by focusing on Ethereum, since that's the technology we spend most of our time working on in our jobs at ConsenSys, and because we know where to get the data, which is another big blocker to understanding decentralization in blockchains, we feel. So within the context of Ethereum, we wanted to ask, will the trends we can observe now and over the past few years change with the adoption of proof of stake? And if yes, how? And will that lead us toward further decentralization, or do we have concerns about areas of centralization?
So what do we actually talk about when we're talking about decentralization? And how can we objectively measure its extent and monitor its evolution over time? What data can we measure? How objective can we determine that data to be? And then can we also look at past historical trends and predict what decentralization will be in the future? So first, it's necessary and important to understand that binary is not an is or is not condition. It's very complex. It exists on a gradient, and it's very emergent, and it changes and it evolves as the technology grows. So as we started these sort of investigations around data and decentralization, and then as Sinju asked us to sort of put it in the framework of proof of stake as well, we sort of set out to answer these few questions. And the 5 of them are, is Ethereum proof of work growing more decentralized over time? Is there data showing that the network is growing more centralized in certain areas? Given the trends that we have observed and are observing, can we make any meaningful predictions about the future? How will this switch to proof of stake affect the centralization or decentralization trends of Ethereum? And which of these metrics are we able to compare across the protocols? So those are the questions that we started framing this investigation off of.
Acknowledge that some of the metrics we're discussing, for instance, the token holding percentage among whales, might not be considered the most important or revelatory measure of decentralization. Where we find the real power concentrations in blockchain networks likely exists in less easily defined areas like the relationship and power dynamics between core developers and prominent miners. But a relationship, of course, is difficult to quantify, and we still believe there's utility in starting from the ground up and quantifying what we can, so we have objective starting points from which to approach more difficult and nuanced studies. So for as many of these data points as we could, we tracked their evolution quarter over quarter as far back as possible. Many we could do all the way from the earliest days of Ethereum through adoption, speculation, the big hacks, CryptoKitties, the bubble in early 2018, and the course correction of last year. Much of the data in this talk was provided by Alethio, which is part of ConsenSys, their data analytics company providing real-time access and analysis into on-chain Ethereum activity. So thank you, Alethio.
So we began looking at Ethereum's architecture as it exists today in the proof of work consensus algorithm. And we wanted to measure Ethereum's decentralization over time by determining which aspects of Ethereum's architecture and usage, both on and off chain, most significantly impact its decentralization. So to start off, we identified these 19 key subsystems that are spread across 4 categories. And we attempted to anchor our conclusions in as much verifiable data, ideally on-chain data, as possible. So it's important to note that there are data points that we've not covered that we do consider important. And those are some off-chain and a bit more nebulous concepts like the strength and distribution of power grids or the legal jurisdictions that miners are operating in. Those are sort of part of another analysis and not really as on-chain data driven, so those aren't discussed today. It's important to note, sort of as we're going through this, that we see about half of these subsystems that are spread across the node and the protocol categories, pretty directly tied to the proof of work consensus algorithm. So these will be the architecture components that we focus on and discuss in more detail in a bit when we're discussing the shift to proof of stake. But for now, we're looking at, what has Ethereum been doing from a decentralization perspective as it works today with proof of work and Ethereum 1.0.
Yeah, so we'll show you a different version of this chart later, and basically the whole left side will look different.
So we wanted to ask this question: which of these subsystems, or those 19 subsystems, when observed over time, appear to be reliably decentralizing? So we're going to run through those graphs in a bit. So this graph that's on the screen now shows the growth of accounts on Ethereum over time. So the x-axis is time, which is represented quarter over quarter, as most of the charts are in this presentation. And the y-axis is the number of addresses. So the blue line shows the growth in all addresses created on the network over time. And the red line shows the number of active addresses over time. So the way that we're defining active addresses is the number of distinct addresses that have transacted or made a contract call at least once within that quarter. And then as you can see, that's noted there, that spike in 2016 was the Shanghai attack during DevCon 2 in China, which is just an interesting blip in the data. So as we can expect, the blue line demonstrates a progressive increase in the number of transactions on Ethereum. We see active addresses, however, more or less flattening after the bubble of Q4 2017. So the story that this graph could tell us is that people are using the network less after the bubble, because the number of active addresses has pretty much more or less stayed flat, despite a growth in overall addresses on Ethereum.
So when we look at the number of transactions and contract calls over time, we see the cumulative number of records quarter over quarter basically aligning with the number of active addresses, including a recent uptick in Q2 of last year. And what we think this could indicate, although it would require more research to confirm it, is that we see a consistent level of activity despite the growth in the overall number of addresses. So in other words, the number of people being active on the network stays pretty consistent, and they're transacting a pretty consistent amount quarter over quarter. So there are two ways we can look at this. First, we could argue that this points to Ethereum's continuing utility and the resiliency of network participants committed to using Ethereum despite the fluctuation in price of ETH. Second, we could argue that it indicates a consistent point of centralization on Ethereum, with most of the activity on the network relying on a pretty small group of users who keep transacting over time. So we want to continue to investigate how many of these active addresses are repeat versus one-off users on the network to understand what this means about decentralization. I also just want to say we have the chat open in a different window, so we'll try to look at it in case anyone asks a question, but we will take questions at the end. So sorry if someone's asked a question and we ignored you. We can't see your chat.
So this graph is another way to look at addresses when we're considering decentralization and activity on Ethereum. So this is, again, total addresses, which is in gray. And then we have what we're calling a meaningful non-zero balance, and that's the blue line. So when we were looking at non-zero addresses, we didn't really think that we'd get an accurate view of things if we looked at addresses that had an absolute balance of 0 ETH. So we defined meaningful non-zero as addresses within that quarter that had enough ETH to at least perform one transaction based off of the gas fee. So all the accounts that held a smaller balance than that are considered essentially zero balance, because it was pretty unlikely that they'd be able to cover the gas fee to execute even one transaction. So that's how we define non-zero. But what this graph is showing us is a pretty steady linear increase in non-zero addresses quarter over quarter, with no major bumps, and not even during pretty dramatic price fluctuations. And we think that tells a pretty powerful story. We can't necessarily say that it means that there's a steady increase in the number of individuals holding ETH, because addresses are not directly tied one-to-one to identities, but it's definitely not an off-base conclusion to say that the growth in non-zero addresses is correlated to the growing diversity of people using the network. So it's probably good news for the decentralization of Ethereum, and suggests that we can expect a consistently growing number of ETH holders on the network over time, even in the face of price volatility.
And we could suggest that the growing delta between the non-zero addresses and the total addresses is increasingly made up by smart contract addresses. So that could indicate that the network is still being used as a means of direct peer-to-peer transaction and DApp interactions, i.e. any action that would require a positive ETH balance. But it's also increasingly being used for smart contract functionality. So overall, this would indicate that Ethereum has been supporting more diverse and thus more decentralized types of on-chain business logic over time. Moving on to DeFi and DEXs. Decentralized finance, sometimes called open finance, has been a huge area of growth in Ethereum over the last year. This graph shows the cumulative percentage of addresses on Ethereum that have transacted with a DeFi protocol, including DEXs, over time. For example, in Q2 of last year, all the addresses that since 2015 have interacted with the DeFi platform made up 0.69% of all the addresses on Ethereum in that quarter, which was about 88 million. This graph appears to show DeFi usage as a percentage decreasing over time, suggesting that DeFi adoption isn't growing at the same rate as the number of new addresses on the network. But that doesn't add up given what we can observe about the ecosystem anecdotally. So we decided to look at the data in a different way.
So we took this data that shows, maybe not a great story about DeFi adoption, and we split it up into the percentage of Ethereum addresses that have been active on DEXs, which is the top chart in red, and then other non-DEX DeFi platforms in orange on the bottom. So when we split up that data in that way, we see a pretty different story. If we look just at the DEX chart, which is in red, we see a decline in DEX usage, again, from a percentage of addresses perspective, over the course of 2018 and 2019 following the price bubble. That decrease in volume likely has something to do with the decreasing number of transactions and the increasing number of new addresses on Ethereum over the same time period. However, when we look at that bottom chart in orange, and we see non-DEX DeFi growth and adoption, we see that people's interaction has been increasing pretty dramatically with a growing diversity of DeFi applications. These opposing trends between DEXs and the non-DEX DeFi, they definitely deserve more analysis, but it does suggest to us that very early in this DeFi ecosystem, access to decentralized finance-related applications was largely restricted to just DEXs, and that was really people's only opportunity to be transacting in a DeFi platform on Ethereum. So overall, we could say that though DeFi usage as a whole has decreased the past few quarters in relation to the growing number of Ethereum addresses, that decrease is due specifically to a decrease in DEX usage as a percentage of a whole. And we see that non-DEX DeFi usage has actually increased dramatically in the same time frame. And because DEXs have been around for much longer, they have a much larger user base and they skew the data quite a bit to suggest a decline in DeFi usage, when in reality, the newest wave of DeFi has introduced a host of new protocols and adoption is rising pretty dramatically. So from a decentralization perspective, this means that the ecosystem is moving towards a greater number of active use cases, active dApps, and smart contracts. And it also means that there are many more options for people to execute decentralized finance, which means fewer central points and fewer choke points of failure across the entire ecosystem.
Now looking at tokens. This graph illustrates ETH ownership of the top 10 addresses in pink, the top 100 in yellow, and the top 1,000 in green as a percentage of the total supply. So the story this chart tells seems fairly visible. The top 10 and top 100 addresses on the network are owning a steadily lower percentage of the total ETH over time. This trend might just be the passive result of increasing supply, diluting the percentage owned by the top whales. But the trend is still significant to overall decentralization of ownership. Interestingly, the top 1,000 addresses have had a recent increase in their percentage ownership of the total ETH supply. Some of the larger accounts from the top 10 and top 100 have possibly been pushed down into lower tiers in recent quarters, which could account for the recent uptick in the top 1,000 accounts. Looking at the overall trends since 2015, we see that ETH ownership is becoming more dispersed across addresses. We can't necessarily assume that more addresses holding smaller amounts of ETH means more unique individuals participating in the network for the same reason we said before. But we saw the number of non-zero addresses increasing and the concentration of the top 10 and top 100 decreasing alongside one another over time. With the ecosystem being as young as it is, the unequal concentration of wealth this early on isn't necessarily a major red flag in terms of decentralization in the longer term. But looking ahead, ETH concentration in the hands of a few becomes a concern when the network shifts to proof of stake starting in a few months. And proof of stake influence on the network is more closely correlated with ownership of ETH. So as ETH2 rolls out, it'll be important to watch out for staking power concentrating in the hands of a few whales.
Sure. So we're going to look at not just ETH, but tokens as well. So the green line in this graph shows the total amount of circulating ETH, which is the ETH moving between addresses quarter over quarter. It's essentially correlated with the price of ETH, with the spike in circulating ETH aligning with the price high in late 2017 and early 2018. And the colored bars show the volume of a few selected ERC20 tokens circulating quarter over quarter. So the tokens we measured here are the top 10 by market cap, and then a few interesting and notable ones that we wanted to look at that include DAI, Loom, and Matic, and a couple others. So the purpose of this graph was to see if activity on the network was growing more and more diverse from both a utility and a speculation perspective. What we believe it shows is that despite a relatively stagnant ETH price recently, compared to fluctuations in the past, the ETH value in circulating tokens is increasing pretty steadily. So not only is the circulating value of tokens increasing, but the diversity and market share of tokens are increasing too, suggesting that users are using more ERC20 tokens, and they're doing more with them across the board. We also, chose to look at here quite a few stable coins in the past few quarters, and stable coins don't offer necessarily any opportunity for much speculation, and we think that supports our conclusion that the growth in both ETH value and diversity of ERC20 tokens in the past few quarters is due to people diversifying their activity on the network and not just using ETH for speculative purposes. This means that people have more options, that network activity isn't just contained to a few protocols, and that the network is steadily decentralizing, at least in terms of token usage and token diversity.
Moving along to nodes. This animation shows nodes by country. So we graphed geographical distribution and concentration of nodes composing the network over time. We expected that the geographic diversity would generally increase, even if the overall number of nodes peaked when the price was highest in early 2018. So we quickly found that our first hurdle was actually trying to find this data. Data about nodes is notoriously difficult to gather, it's harder to validate, and it's very difficult to track historically. So the data in this animation is from the node tracker on Etherscan. They graciously gave us access to their historical data, which goes back to October 2018. So this animation shows the node count by country over basically the last year. We couldn't go any further than that. The animation is a heat map, so the warm colors are the countries with the highest node counts, and the cooler colors are the countries with lower node counts. So in general, we see some bare areas that stay pretty consistently bare, especially in Africa and parts of the Middle East. Of the countries that have maintained nodes over time, we're seeing fairly uniform fluctuations rather than random spikes or drops in particular jurisdictions. And despite the opportunity for greater distribution that's clear in some regions, we think the data demonstrates impressive geographic decentralization across the world in a variety of legal and political systems. So this is obviously like a very literal way to show that the network is decentralizing physically over time.
So after we looked at some of these subsystems that indicate a message of decentralization, we also looked at a number of subsystems and found that they sort of pointed towards some areas of centralization across Ethereum's architecture. So we wanted to drill down on those in a bit more detail. So I don't think that's showing up yet. Oh, there we go. So these two graphs, the top graph and the bottom graph, show the growing concentration of mining pools over time as measured by a percentage of total block production, which is shown in the top, and percentage of total addresses paid out per quarter, which is in the bottom graph. So in each graph, colors correspond to the same mining pool. So for instance, the green bars on the bottom of each graph are all Ethermine, and you can see the legend on the right-hand side. So the top graph represents the percentage of blocks for which each miner was responsible quarter over quarter. The largest producers, which we're most interested in for this particular data set, are all the mining pools. So in Q4 2019, for instance, which is the bar on the far right, we see that Ethermine was responsible for 22.49% of the blocks mined that quarter, which is up from 8.84% in Q2 of 2016. The bottom graph shows of the on-chain addresses that are paid mining rewards, what percentage of those payouts each mining pool is responsible for. So it's important to note that this data is only particularly insightful for mining pools that pay out their mining rewards directly to users' on-chain addresses. Some mining pools pay miners through direct deposit or other off-chain methods that can't really be tracked with this data pool. But this is still a very good reflection of mining pool concentration and behavior across Ethereum. So over time, what this data is showing us is we see 4 pools that have started to dominate the mining pool landscape. Ethermine, F2 pool, Spark pool, and Nano pool. Collectively, they've edged out some past competitors like Mining Pool Hub and Dwarf Pool 1 over the past year or so. So today, those 4 main pools account for over 72% of quarterly block production, and they pay out to over 80% of the miners across mining pools. In particular, we're seeing a potentially concerning dominance in block production between Ethermine and Spark pool, which today account for 52% of the blocks produced per quarter. And together, Ethermine and Nano pool pay out to nearly 70% of miners on chain. Showing it.
Sorry, we have a bit of a lag in our graph here.
Oh,
there it goes.
So when we look specifically at the average hash rate among mining pools across Q2, we see that in Q4, the average hash rate of mining pools tipped to reach over 50% among a small number. So just in the past quarter, Ethermine and Spark pool accounted for, on average, just over 51% of the total hash rate on Ethereum. That is a point of centralization. However, theoretically, the concentration of influence among a few mining pools is not necessarily a major concern. Miners are supposedly pool agnostic, which means they will migrate to whichever pool offers the best incentives. So if we assume that these miners are going to act rationally, if a single pool were to reach a hash rate close to 50%, or as we're seeing here, 2 pools reach, a 51% hash rate, the miners would theoretically abandon these pools and move to other pools to protect their income. So what we wanted to do was essentially test that hypothesis, and we tried to do a more complete data analysis before we presented at Coinbase, and then we tried to do it before this, but our data sets keep crashing because it's so much data. But we have this to prove or to talk about the ideas behind it. So we wanted to test the assumption that miners will behave rationally if hash rate begins to be concentrated in the hands of a few mining pools. So what we did is we visualized miners' relationships to different pools. So we pulled data for payout transactions of all mining pools for a random 24-hour period, in this case, November 3rd. So each of the dense colored circles, which are sort of around the edges, represent a mining pool address, and the web of dots around it show addresses that have received a payout. So again, this is only for on-chain payouts. The red dots in the middle of this chart were the addresses that received mining rewards for more than one mining pool within that 24-hour period. So we can see that when compared to the number of miners in each pool, the overlap rate is pretty low. But it still indicates that there are miners just within this 24-hour period who, for one reason or another, did not remain loyal to just one pool, and instead were working with multiple different pools. So this is just a quick snapshot of something that, now that we know that hash rate among those 2 mining pools has tipped over 51% in the past quarter, we want to be able to take this data set and expand it over time and see, as those hash rates have sort of ticked up among those 2 mining pools, if miners have become more and more active with a multitude of mining pools in order to prove that assumption of rational behavior by miners. But for the time being, we are still running with the assumption that the concentration of influence, let's say in hash rate, among a few mining pools is not ideal, but that miners could be assumed rational and pool agnostic. However, even with that assumption, when we look at the number of mining pools and the number of miners over time, which is what this chart shows, we see a pretty distinct decline in both over the last year. So this graph shows the change in the number of miners in red alongside the number of mining pools in orange. And since the market bubble, we've seen both drop, especially the number of miners. In short, what this means is that fewer miners are active on fewer mining pools, and fewer mining pools, as we just saw before, are responsible for most of the network maintenance. And then just to reiterate, it's really important to emphasize that the number of miners on this graph is not an exact number because we identified the number of miners in mining pools based on-chain payouts. And some of those mining pools pay members off-chain, so it could be higher. On the other hand, since we track data quarter over quarter, it's possible that we've captured some duplication. The miners represented by those red dots in the previous graph would technically be considered 2 miners in, let's say, the 2019 quarter. So the number could actually be lower if we considered duplicate counting. But this could be considered a pretty fair assessment of the number of miners. So overall, what these graphs have shown is that mining pools are an area of increasing centralization on the Ethereum network. Lower ETH prices recently, reduced block rewards, and a fairly stagnant hash rate have meant that fewer miners are incentivized to join the network, and the laws of efficiency have really just concentrated the influence across the network into the hands of fewer and fewer mining pools. And this is something that we'll talk about in a bit more detail, but the switch to proof of stake starting this year will completely redefine this area of centralization. And until then, or even as Ethereum 2.0 is rolled out, it will be pretty important for the Ethereum ecosystem to keep an eye on mining pool influence to ensure that we don't continue to be too centralized in this matter.
So, waiting for so there has been a lot of fluctuation in the total count of full nodes running the Ethereum network. For example, right now, the number is about half of what it was around this time last year. On the surface, that looks a lot like centralization. If there are fewer nodes overall, then there are presumably fewer people running nodes. There are a lot of reasons why this could be, but here are 2 factors we looked at to see if there's a correlation. So the graph on the left is our first assumption, which is maybe when the price of ETH is higher, the number of nodes increases because miners can expect to make more money. The graph shows that that's actually not the case, at least over the course of 2019, which again is all the data we were able to get from Etherscan. When we look at the node count, which is the blue part, versus the price of ETH, which is the green line, over time, it looks like there's actually a negative correlation between them. The node count was at one of its lowest points in June of last year when the price of ETH was highest, and it was quite high during the price dip at the end of the summer. So even if this correlation wasn't true was true historically, it doesn't seem to be true in today's ecosystem. The graph on the right shows our second assumption, which is that maybe as the average node data size increases over time, fewer people will be incentivized to run nodes. We graph the node count in blue against the total size of the default node on Geth in red and parity in orange. About 97% of all Ethereum nodes are running one of those 2 clients, and about 95% of the nodes on the network are default nodes, as opposed to archive nodes, which would have a much higher data burden. Just quickly, want to note that you see a big dip in the Geth node size in July of last year, which coincided with the new version release that resulted in a big decrease in the size of the data. So obviously, the average node size is more or less increasing over time as more blocks are mined and more data stored on the blockchain. It seems reasonable to assume that as the default node size gets bigger, it gets more expensive and takes more energy to keep a node running and to keep it synced. So maybe fewer people are choosing to do so. And it looks like that's the case if we look at the graph on the right, or at least there's a clearer correlation than there is with the price of ETH. So as we move toward proof of stake and sharding the network, the node size burden won't be as much of an issue. So maybe this attrition won't continue on the same trend throughout 2020. There are also some interesting experiments happening around the ecosystem to find ways to make nodes cheaper and easier to run. Shout out to our colleague, Daniel Ellison, who is working on this at ConsenSys. We'll keep tracking this data set throughout the changes of the coming year on the network. again, all of this is on Etherscan if you want to try it yourself. So now looking at decentralization in ETH2. As we look toward proof of stake gradually unrolling, starting with phase 0 and the beacon chain, what can we expect to change? What changes with the switch from using miners to run the blockchain to using validators and staking to produce blocks and establish finality? So first we wanted to ask the question, of the data points we've already calculated historically, which ones will be most affected by the shift to Ethereum 2.0? So the first is the node count. The barrier to entry to becoming a validator, i.e. staking 32 ETH, is theoretically much lower than becoming a miner, which requires purchasing expensive hardware and spending a lot of money running that hardware, consuming a lot of energy. Security in ETH2 depends on the distribution of validators rather than of nodes, so we could expect the network to become much more distributed and therefore decentralized in ETH2 eventually, which is a big caveat. In proof of work, physical concentrations of miners arose from the complicated off-chain matters of hardware acquisition, energy cost, and economies of scale in big mining operations. The world of validators in ETH2 will be more transparent and open because the amount staked and the actions of the validators will all happen directly on chain. But a small number of initial validators early on in phase 0 could potentially bring a period of high centralization on the network. In other words, like when phase 0 actually launches, we go from a pretty big number of nodes and miners to potentially a pretty small number of initial validators. So that's something to look at. A second thing to watch is the node size. In ETH1, state is stored on either a local hard drive or on the node one is interacting with, like an Infura node. In ETH2, state is distributed, so you might store relevant pieces of state locally or through a provider of state. But in any case, the data burden of the blockchain, so that graph I just showed before, is not necessarily a limiting factor to running a node. So more people can become validators without that big burden of energy and hardware that comes with mining.
And of the data that we've already shown and that we've already discussed, we also, we're considering that the meaning of ETH ownership will change with the switch to proof of stake. And ownership of ETH will no longer just be about having a certain amount of wealth or being able to say, or being able to have an outsized influence on, say, a DApp or a DEX. ETH ownership will now be tied directly to the maintenance of the protocol because it determines one's ability to be a validator via the amount of ETH that they have and the amount of ETH that they can stake and the number of blocks for which they're responsible. That means whales could theoretically have a more outsized influence over the maintenance and security of the network than they would have had in proof of work if they were just high ETH holders. But there's also a limit to that influence. Where in proof of work, the miners that were sort of behind that validation could really benefit from the economies of scale that are involved from buying huge amounts of hardware and then living somewhere with low energy costs.
Yeah.
The benefit of having, let's say, if you had exactly 32 ETH or if you had thousands of ETH, it's more of a linear contribution to the validation of the network rather than those compounding exponential economies of scale that proof of work was able to benefit from. We also, per the mining conversation that we had, needed to note that that's going to change a lot. Mining pool hash rate, as we showed, is an area of continuing centralization in ETH 1.0, but it doesn't become a factor in ETH 2.0. Validators are going to stake 32 ETH for the ability to validate blocks and then earn block rewards for essentially enforcing those rules. Proof of stake punishes failing validators by slashing portions of their stake. And a 51% attack, or theoretically a mining pool or 2 or 3 mining pools controlling the majority of hashing power, is almost impossible in ETH 2.0 as it's being projected to evolve, because the validator or the staking pool would need to own the majority of the ether on the entire network, and that's first an extremely unlikely case, and then they would be highly disincentivized to attack the network were they to own that much ETH. So we anticipate sort of the dangers of mining pool hash rate decreasing as staking pools start emerging in ETH 2.0.
So we'll look at that chart we started out with again. So as we look toward POS gradually being adopted in phase 0 with the beacon chain, what should we be assessing to determine how the network is decentralizing? So we recreated our original chart with an eye toward proof of stake. We took into account the replacement of miners with validators. We kept a number of the subsystems focused on staking pools. As we've learned from proof of work, efficiency and economies of scale can result in some scary looking areas of centralization among pools, especially in the earlier stages of a technology's evolution. So as ETH2 rolls out, it's important to keep an eye on these subsystems and keep adding any subsystems we consider vital to the decentralization in the future. As Ethereum and other blockchains migrate toward other, oh, sorry, I'm waiting for our slide to come up. So it's going to prove valuable to determine how to compare decentralization across different protocols. As we've seen just from the switch to proof of work Ethereum to proof of stake Ethereum, almost half of these subsystems of decentralization don't carry over across those two consensus mechanisms. So across totally different blockchains, it's important for us to identify which we can confidently and fairly compare across protocols with different rules. As more protocols switch to proof of stake, hopefully those cross-protocol comparative metrics will expand and we can keep updating the ecosystem on the relative decentralization of different blockchains. But key to providing this information is availability of data. As we were doing this analysis for Ethereum, we recognized very early on the difficulty of assessing certain types of information. Ethereum is fortunate enough to have a lot of robust data tools, and even then our on-chain analysis was incomplete. So for other blockchains, the data can be nearly inaccessible to the public. So as we migrate to proof of stake, our hope is that everyone continues to recognize the value of public data and begins to collect all types of on-chain data as early as possible so we can all track this stuff together. And only then can we confidently track decentralization starting with phase 0. So what conclusions can we take from all this? First, overall, in Ethereum as it is today, most crucial subsystems of decentralization do appear to be progressively decentralizing, signaling that the ecosystem is heading in a good direction. In proof of work, the network is most clearly decentralizing when it comes to the reduction in holding power of the top 10 and top 100 addresses. The clearest area of centralization, as we've said, is in mining pools and the concentration of hash power among a handful of pools, actually 2 pools.
Yeah. Another conclusion of ours is that the switch to proof of work will affect existing subsystems of decentralization mostly by placing new importance on token ownership, by ameliorating the growing influence of mining pools, and then also alleviating some of the concerns around node size. The 5th conclusion is that emerging subsystems of decentralization we should consider with proof of stake are mostly around validators, their quantity, their distribution, their average stake, and their impact and involvement with staking pools. And lastly, as we mentioned, and that we will continue to reiterate anytime we talk about this data, is that it's very crucial to have accessible historical data about any public blockchain so that people can come, they can watch relevant metrics, they can verify other metrics that people are publishing. Without it, these sorts of really vital analyses are not possible within protocols and certainly not between protocols. So that's sort of our last point to drive home.
Thanks again to Alethio for all of this data.
Yeah.
I also saw our brilliant colleague Igor Lilich answering a couple of questions in the chat, it looked like. So thanks, Igor. You guys should ask him questions and not us. But we can now take any questions in the chat if you guys have any. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, we can give you all a few minutes back before your next presentation. Thanks again, Shinju, for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody. Good night.
All right. So we're going to pass it off to Youngblood. So I'm going to switch the session right now.